What's up, guys? This is Desm101. Welcome back for another episode of In Defense Of, where I take a look at a game that's generally unpopular and not very well liked, and I give you my take on it and why I think it might be worth your time. Today, we're going to have a look at Ironsword, which is actually the sequel to Wizards and Warriors on the NES, and it's part of a trilogy of games made by Rare. This one came out in 1989, and it was published by Acclaim. Now, in general, most people are going to tell you that the original Wizards and Warriors is a pretty good game, and I'd agree with that. This is probably the most well-known of the trilogy, and more people have played it. You collect items and special weapons that you can use against bosses and stuff like that, and you have to get to the second part of the level by giving a specific amount of gems to a warrior that's blocking your path, and you rescue maidens. Pretty simple, and it's not too hard. You get unlimited continues, but in the sequel, they basically amped the difficulty up quite a bit and added a few extra things, as well as kind of kept some things pretty similar to the first one. In my opinion, they did a pretty good job, but other people might say that they messed it up or made it overly complicated. It definitely has some issues. So overall, the game is unconventional compared to most platformers, so you might have to learn a few different methods and approach it in a different way than you might other platforming games. I think this is where a lot of people get thrown off when they're expecting it to play something like Super Mario 3 or other platformers that they're more familiar with. But the thing is, the controls are quite a bit different, and the way that you play it is probably not how you'd expect it to be. So you kind of got to be patient with it. It's an example of that classic Rare difficulty, which, if you play Battletoads, you know that Rare can make some really hard games. Snake Rattle and Roll is another example. So, some very tough challenge on the NES, and this game is no exception. You're going to have to really practice it, use a guide, and just kind of learn how to get through the game. I'll give you some tips that might make it a little easier if you... Now let's talk about some of the issues in the game. First thing that I always kind of had an issue with was the way Kuros looked. So on the cover, you might see he's got the picture of Fabio, which is probably how the game is most well known, is just for that Fabio cover art. He even had a cartoon character. Kuros was a cartoon character in a show called The Power Team, which was on Video Power. And it wasn't a very good cartoon, but he was one of the stars in there, and he appeared very similar like he does here, kind of like a Conan the Barbarian character. But when you start the game and you look at him, he looks super cartoony and really odd. The cover of the game, this is false advertising, because he looks so goofy right off the bat. You can get a helmet, and you can collect further items like shield upgrades and sword upgrades, which will help you a bit, and it actually makes the character look a lot cooler. So at the beginning of the game, yeah, he doesn't look very cool. Now what about the sword? So the attack button just kind of seems useless. He kind of does like a really odd thrust. If you duck an attack, he does kind of like a poke. You can kind of use that one a little bit against some enemies if they get close to you. The attack button is only useful when you have a magic item, and then you can shoot off that magic like the spells that you use against the elemental enemies. You'll want to just be jumping around and trying to poke enemies with the sword when you're in a jump. And that's really how you have to learn the physics and mechanics of the game, is because enemies will just constantly be barraging you the whole time, and you have to defend against it, and there's not really much way you can except for jumping and then trying to hit the enemies with the tip of your sword as you're jumping. It's pretty awkward. The more you practice it and the more that you play the game, you'll get the hang of it, and it kind of makes sense, but at first it's really awkward and it's kind of hard to get the hang of. A few tips that I would give are to just make sure you learn the jump well. You can hold the jump button and it'll actually continuously jump, which is useful in a lot of levels, like especially the cloud level. You can do that. You need to know which chests are required and which ones might waste keys. And learning where everything is in the game is really going to help you, especially in that way. And you only have 2 continues in the game, unlike the first game that had unlimited continues. You only have 2, and if you make it to the last level, even if you have more continues, it'll actually get rid of them at Icefire Mountain. So don't know if that's a glitch or why they did that, but it really ups the difficulty. Now here's some things that I think it does well. I think it has a cool look to the graphics, like some of the things like the eagle that lifts you up, some of the birds have some really nice animations. You know, the levels, they look pretty cool, some of the enemies look pretty cool. So, and there's a variety to, you know, the themes of the levels and the enemies, so I think those are all pluses. Some weird, unique enemies like water zombies and some weird, creepy, like underwater stuff. That's pretty creative. There's even like weird little smiley face things that guard some of the secret items. You need to find things all throughout the level, so there's a lot of like exploration involved in this game. Not quite like a Metroidvania or something like that, there's no backtracking. But the more time you spend looking around the level, the more it's going to pay off, the more you familiarize with it. And there are special hidden items, hidden rooms everywhere. You can get lots of extra money. And there's lots of neat little spaces where you can find a secret, even a secret within a secret. So it kind of pays to just explore a lot. You'll often just jump into a random hidden door and appear into a secret room. Boss fights. There are some pretty unique boss fights. The boss fights are not the most, you know, creative designs that I've seen in an NES game. They're actually relatively simple and they're very easy if you have the magic spell. But it's a kind of a cool change of pace from the rest of the game where stuff is just coming at you non-stop and killing you really quickly. Here you can actually, you know, kind of enjoy the boss fight, relax a little bit. You know, there are some more at the end, like I mentioned, you fight them again, which is kind of, they're a way different boss fight than the earlier ones. And the music, I should have mentioned, the music is really well done. It fits this game pretty well. It suits it. It's definitely a memorable part of the game. So I think it's a plus for it, and it kind of fits in with the medieval theme overall. So I think the atmosphere of the game is something that they've pulled off really well. And the last thing that I really like is the gambling. It's one of those NES games that has gambling in it, and the gambling game in here is particularly cool from an artistic design perspective. And you just watch the little mini skull drop down the bones and you pick the cup. I've heard there are ways to pick a pattern that you can repeatedly get wins, but I haven't actually tried that out myself. So overall, this might be one of those games where I just have a lot of nostalgia for it. I think it's still a lot of fun to play. It's quite a challenge. There are some additional glitches and bugs that you can use to make the game a little easier, such as retaining your magic abilities after you've defeated a boss. If you shoot the magic at the piece of the Ironsword when you collect it instead of grabbing it physically, and you're positioned directly on the door, you can keep the magic until the next level, which you can use against enemies during that first part, and you can actually use it to shoot at the golden items, which will acquire it for you, make it a lot easier. This can simplify the game and make it quite a bit more forgiving and playable, so I recommend trying it this way. You can see for yourself if it makes it a little more fun for you. There's some other bugs and stuff that you can use on the bosses. I won't go into all of them, but you can read a guide, and I actually recommend that if you want to play this game through to the end, you should go ahead and use the guide. There's also a password system, so I think that's at least one plus side on the difficulty. But still, it's a hard game. You're going to have to figure out how to keep Kuros from dying really quickly, which I find some of the hit detection is a bit odd. So there are definitely some flaws with the game, but I think if you kind of look past some of those conventional approaches to this type of platforming adventure game and just have an open mind, you can probably have a pretty good time with it. You find it for a good price, and I think it's a pretty fun game that still holds up if you're into this kind of quirky NES genre. Alright, that's going to wrap it up for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a good one, and I will see you next time.